Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Maryland Historical Society's virtual program and to another Unlocking the Exhibition. Today, we will be joined by 4 of my colleagues who work here at the Maryland Historical Society to unlock some secrets and stories of a new exhibition that opens virtually on September 9th, Forgotten Fight, the Struggle for Voting Rights in Maryland. And I am your host today, Margot Copera, the museum's Public Programs Manager. It is time to get started and unlock the exhibition, The Women in Forgotten Fight. Now, if you are not already aware, just 2 days ago on August 18th, our country celebrated the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the passage of the 19th Amendment. In February of this year, we also marked the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote. In light of these monumental anniversaries, we wanted to bring you a program that celebrates an even larger message. Today, the struggle for the right to vote for all Americans has been largely forgotten. Only 60% of all eligible voters, including 66% in Maryland, participated in the general election of 2016, a turnout that does not honor or remember the extraordinary fight for voting rights in the United States. Originally scheduled as an in-person exhibition, Forgotten Fight, the Struggle for Voting Rights in Maryland, will be the Maryland Historical Society's first ever virtual exhibition. Marylanders have been on the forefront of the forgotten fight for voting rights since one of the colonists asked for her voice in 1648. This struggle for voting rights in Maryland spans nearly 400 years, and with Maryland being an important battleground in the fight for all voices to be heard, Forgotten Fight will exhibit all forms of suffrage. So, in diving into our collections in preparation for this virtual exhibition in September, what we unlocked through these objects and how we can elevate these women through their objects will be the focus of our conversation today. To help do this, I am so excited to introduce my colleagues to the program. We can just have there they are, here they are. Hi, everyone, welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome all, it's so nice to be together today, at least virtually. Ashley, you are the museum's digital learning specialist within the education department. Audience members may recognize you from all the educational initiatives that you manage and from social media, in particularly the Ask a Historian video series on Facebook. Did you want to just briefly explain what you do also within your educational role?
Yeah, so as Margot said, you might recognize me from our social media initiatives, but as the digital learning specialist, I am also in charge of our virtual field trips for K through 12 students as well as adult groups. So hello, if I've seen you before or if you're new, I hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you, Ashley. We're also joined, Ashley, by our colleagues who played a large role in developing the Forgotten Fight exhibition. First, we have Harrison Van Ways. He is the Associate Registrar here at MCHC. Sorry, Harrison, I just looked at something in the chat. Harrison, we just enjoyed watching your interview with Kelly Lynn on WJLA yesterday. How was that?
It was very good. We talked about suffrage, we talked about anti-suffrage, talked about the upcoming online exhibit, which we're all very excited for.
Yes, we are. And it was everyone, please check out that video. It's on our website. It's on our social media, actually. We're also joined by Mallory Herberger, Special Collection archivist with us. Our audience out there may know Mallory from visiting our library. How are you doing today, Mallory?
Good, Margot. Thank you.
Welcome. And finally, we have Joe Chopea, our curator of films and photographs, with us today. How are you, Joe?
I'm doing great, Margot. How you doing?
Very well. Welcome all to our virtual program. Ashley, we are excited to have you start this conversation with some background on suffrage. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I'm excited to get started. So are we about ready to jump in?
Yeah, I'm going to let you take it away and get started. There's a lot of objects and stories to cover.
Absolutely. So we are going to dive right in. We are very excited to present our Unlocking the exhibition. Today we are going to be focusing on the women in the forgotten fight. So this is just a sample of what we will be able to show you in our first virtual exhibit. Before we get started, I just want to clarify, we're going to be speaking about suffragists from Maryland today. And I kind of want to start with explaining the term suffragist versus suffragette. So we as historians, we prefer to use the word suffragist. The word suffragette, especially during the 20th century, during the movements that were happening, the word suffragette was used as more of kind of a pejorative term. People would refer to suffragists as suffragettes because the suffix et, E-T-T-E, in French means cute or little. So that was a way to try to demean the suffrage movement. As we know, that didn't stop these remarkable women from continuing to fight for their rights. And I want to start off by first discussing Margaret Brent. She is an early example of a suffragist. So Brent and her family immigrated from England to Maryland in 1638. They were related to the Calvert family. And Margaret Brent in particular, she remained unmarried for her entire life. That allowed her to be a landowner and a businesswoman, which was pretty uncommon for the time period. So if she had married or decided to share her life with somebody, that meant her wealth and her property would have gone to her husband. So she chose to remain unmarried, and throughout her life, she gained the confidence of Governor Leonard Calvert. And after his death, she was actually put in charge of his affairs. Now, when he passed away, he owed debt to soldiers who had fought during the Ingalls Rebellion, which was an offshoot of the English Civil War in 1645. And these soldiers, they were on the verge of rebelling. They wanted to get paid and paid quickly. So Margaret Brent, she needed to have this money or be given this money in order to pay off these soldiers. So what she needed to do was go to the Maryland Assembly and request the right to vote. And she did this not only as someone who was in charge of Calvert's affairs, but also because she was a landowner and she wanted to have a voice in the framing of the laws, as we can see in this quote. Unfortunately, the Maryland Assembly did not give her the right to vote. However, she was given the money she needed to pay off the soldiers and keep the peace in Maryland. But she is the first woman in Maryland to request for that right to vote. So like I said, this is in the 1640s, and as we know, it would be many, many years until women actually did gain that right. However, Brent, she continued to kind of push, and because of that, Lord Baltimore was outraged and suspicious that the Brent family was trying to take land and take more money, and so they were pushed into Virginia, where they spent the rest of their life, including Margaret. So she passed away in 1671. Now we're going to fast forward into the 20th century here and talk about another remarkable suffragist. This is Julia Emery, and she was, again, a Baltimore native, and she was very outspoken during the suffrage movement, and she was actually arrested for protesting for the right to vote. And during this time, she was sentenced to 60 days in a workhouse. So workhouses were essentially prisons where suffragists were sent to do hard labor. They were mistreated. One of the most famous workhouses is in Virginia. It's called Occoquan, and that is where Julia Emery was kept for 60 days. Now, this workhouse was notorious for the mistreatment of these suffragists. They were forced to wear deplorable clothing. They were not given enough food or the proper kind of, heating and air conditioning during those hot months. So this is where suffragists would stage protests, and they would refuse to eat the rotten food that they were fed. And upon her release, Julia Emery continued to protest, and she would be sent to Occoquan again. Eventually, she would be released after that second arrest, after a judge ruled that she had been wrongfully imprisoned. And this is all happening around 1917, so this is going up to that cusp before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Another remarkable woman I want to mention is Amelia Himes Walker. She was a opera singer, and the dress that we're seeing, this is her final performance dress. This is the dress she wore for her last performance. We actually have this on display in our Spectrum of Fashion collection that we, unfortunately, we're not open to the public yet, but hopefully you all will be able to come in and admire this dress in person. But after her career as an opera singer, she decided to shift and pivot a little bit and work as a suffragist. So she was very outspoken, and like Julia Emery, she was also arrested for protesting and forced to work in a workhouse. And after she was released, she kept the clothing that she was forced to wear in the workhouse. This clothing was meant to take away women's femininity and try and embarrass them for wearing deplorable clothing. And instead, she kind of turned it on its head, and she wore the clothing all around the country to show how women were being treated for simply asking for the right to vote. So again, she was very, very outspoken. Now we know that we are celebrating the 19th Amendment ratification a couple days ago. However, the state of Maryland would not ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. It would actually be ratified March 29th, 1941, and then the vote was certified officially on February 25th, 1958. So again, there was a lot of work to be done. And finally, I want to highlight two more suffragists, Augusta T. Chisel and Margaret Gregory Walker. These women created their own suffrage groups, and we're going to talk about some other suffrage groups throughout our program. But Augusta T. Chisel and Margaret Gregory Walker were African-American women, and they founded the Progressive Women's Suffrage Club. Now, after the 15th Amendment was ratified, that gave African-American men the right to vote, the suffrage movement really picked up in force. However, some suffrage groups were integrated, and they welcomed everybody. However, many groups in Maryland were actually very segregated. So women like Augusta T. Chisel and Margaret Walker would go out and create their own suffrage groups. And what's really lovely is they worked for the enfranchisement for all women. So this group was non-discriminatory, and they both lived on the 1500 block of Druid Hill, and their homes are now recognized by the sign that we see here, highlighting the African-American women's suffrage movement as well. So these are just a handful of women that really pushed for the right to vote, especially here in Maryland. And I'm going to now turn it over to Mallory to highlight another remarkable woman.
Thanks, Ashley. So there are many women in our collection that are worthy of discussion, but I would say that the most significant from my research is Edith Houghton Hooker, a leader of the women's suffrage movement in Maryland, through her work as president of the Just Government League and editor of the Maryland Suffrage News. But first, a little bit of background about Edith. She was born in Buffalo, New York in 1879 to a fairly progressive family that championed the advancement of women's education. Her mother insisted that her daughters aim to achieve more than that of the traditional roles held by women of the time. Edith and her sister Catherine, who was mother of the actress Katharine Hepburn, both graduated from Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, and Catherine went on to become president of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, as well as a co-founder of Planned Parenthood with Margaret Sanger. Edith herself was one of the first women accepted into Johns Hopkins School of Medicine before moving on to establish a career in social work. She and her husband, Dr. Donald Hooker, whom she had met at Hopkins, together founded the St. George's Guild, a home for unwed mothers and their babies in Baltimore. It was while working with these women that Edith became interested in the idea of women's suffrage, believing that the vote could give women the agency to improve their unhealthy living conditions.
Mallory, how did she become more involved with the suffrage movement throughout her life?
Well, in 1907, she joined the pro-suffrage organization, the Equal Suffrage League of Baltimore. But in 1909, she resigned and formed her own organization, which she named the Just Government League. Her chief aim in organizing the Just Government League was to pass a federal amendment to the Constitution that would give women the right to vote. After repeated failures at the state level, Hooker adopted the methods of fellow suffragist Alice Paul and took her campaign to the streets. She and fellow Just Government League speakers conducted open-air meetings, traveling via automobile to locations around Baltimore to answer questions and defend pro-suffrage arguments. She organized speakers' classes, or basically training sessions, so that the Just Government speakers would be well prepared to present clear arguments in favor of women's suffrage and to refute all arguments against. These speakers then went out to address groups at street corners, and during the colder months, they spoke from parlors in the homes of leading citizens. In 1913 alone, Hooker organized 214 parlor meetings and 86 open-air meetings, with a combined total attendance of 28,910 people. And by 1915, the Just Government League had grown to over 17,000 members, making it the largest pro-suffrage organization in Maryland.
So did Hooker and the Just Government League use any other mediums or methods to spread their message?
They definitely did. In 1912, Edith founded and established herself as the chief editor of the Maryland Suffrage News, a weekly publication on suffrage events and matters of general suffrage interest. The paper ran weekly from 1912 to 1920, when the 19th Amendment was finally passed, and it was so successful that in 1917, Edith Hooker went on to become editor of the National Woman's Party paper, The Suffragist. One of the things that I found interesting when I was going through the issues of the Maryland Suffrage News was the way that the paper used unrelated current events as propaganda for their suffrage arguments. The example that I found most striking was that of the Titanic disaster, the doomed passenger ship that sank in the middle of the Atlantic on April 15, 1912. 1,514 lives were lost at sea, and in the weeks that followed, the Maryland Suffrage News published several articles in response to the tragedy. The first article, dated April 27th, was essentially a call for donations to the Just Government League, comparing those who had died on the Titanic to the women and children suffering in Maryland, and asking readers if they would help pay for the metaphorical lifeboats to save their lives. The second article of May 4th was an opinion piece that asked readers why men would prioritize women and children in the icy waters of the Atlantic, women and children first, but not on land by giving her the right to vote, when doing so would certainly save her life. A quote from the article reads, "The chivalry which men show to women on so many occasions seems to fail when it comes to giving them that which so many of them ardently desire, the vote." And these are just a few examples of the ways in which the Maryland Suffrage News appealed to public opinion to further their agenda and promote the campaign for women's suffrage. And I will end my part here with this final quote from the first issue of the Maryland Suffrage News, which I think concisely describes the tone Hooker set for the paper and the pro-suffrage movement. She wrote, "Let every woman who reads this paper read it with an open mind. Let her search out the real reasons why so many women are demanding political equality with men, and then let her decide, in the white light of her own conscience, whether she can afford to oppose or be indifferent to one of the most unselfish, humanitarian, holiest movements the world has ever known."
Thanks, Mallory. So I want to ask now, was everyone in support of women's suffrage?
Absolutely not. Definitely, there was a major movement against suffragists in Maryland and across the country. It really developed in the United States in the late 19th century. It was dedicated, well-organized. Suffrage groups began to emerge in the 1890s in response to a surge in pro-suffrage groups. The right to vote was also placed on the ballot in several states during this decade. Wyoming, where Ashley is from, was the first state to grant women the right to vote in 1890, and that was really the first serious threat to the anti-suffragists. You may be surprised to know that most of these anti-suffrage groups were organized by other women, not men. On the next slide, we have several resolutions that were passed by one of the Maryland anti-suffrage groups that are on the right, but some of the other main points for the opposition were voting would lead to the decay of the family institution. Women already had unique duties in the domestic sphere and should leave that responsibility to the men. And then another one was votes could potentially be extended to African American women, which was considered unthinkable by many white Americans, particularly Southern women. And then on the next slide, we have several states here, as you can see, in quick succession that granted suffrage to women, including Alaska, which was still a territory at that point. In the 1890s, New York and Massachusetts are the first statewide anti-suffrage organizations, and were followed by dozens of other state or county chapters. New chapters of the Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage were the most common. A surge in these groups occurred in tandem with additional voting rights for women. So in Maryland, we have several anti-suffrage groups. The first were the Women of Talbot County, followed by the Women of Baltimore, and then they quickly changed their name to represent all of Maryland as well. They met monthly and offered featured notable male speakers. One Maryland meeting, for example, in 1912 featured former U.S. Supreme Court Justice, a prominent Maryland lawyer, and Everett P. Wheeler, who was president of the Men's Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. They would even bring in local Boy Scouts to serve as ushers and win merit badges, basically, to help the anti-suffragists at these events. On the next slide, we have a couple of examples of anti-suffrage ephemera that we have in our own collection. These will also be featured in our online exhibit when that comes out in September. I want to talk a little bit about the leaders within this sort of movement. We have, on the left, we have Mary Redwood. She was part of a wealthy old Maryland family. Her husband, Francis, was a Baltimore stockbroker who was killed in a train crash in 1906. Her eldest son, George, was a decorated World War I hero in battle in 1918. And Baltimore's very own Redwood Street was named in his honor. From 1911 to 1919, she served as either president or vice president of the Maryland Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, and was even involved in producing anti-suffrage plays in local theaters. During World War I, she established a sewing circle as an offshoot of the Maryland anti-suffrage chapter, where women could get together, make surgical dressings for a patriotic cause, and discuss their anti-suffrage beliefs. On the right, you have Catherine Barker Johnson Garrett. She was also part of a prominent and wealthy Maryland family. In 1907, she married Robert S. Garrett, who was a highly decorated track and field athlete at the 1896 and 1900 Olympic Games. He was a wealthy banker, and he was also the founder of the Public Athletic League, which is a precursor to the Department of Parks and Recreation in Baltimore. The Garretts were extremely conservative. While Catherine was passionately anti-suffragist, Robert was staunchly segregationist, particularly in regard to public facilities and spaces. During the 12-year run of the Maryland anti-suffrage chapter, she served as either president or vice president, and she also served as treasurer of the national organization, which was based in New York. This final leader that I want to mention is Cardinal James Gibbons. He was the Archbishop of Baltimore and an extremely influential Catholic leader at the turn of the century. He had relationships with 12 U.S. presidents and was a personal advisor to several of them. While he publicly declared his opposition to a suffrage amendment to the Maryland Constitution in 1909, his greatest contribution to the anti-suffrage cause was his letter to Catherine Garrett on April 22, 1913. It was widely printed in many newspapers, read aloud at anti-suffrage events, and was generally referred to as the greatest blow to the Maryland suffrage movement. To his credit, following the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, he did reverse his position on the issue, and he called it, quote, not only a right, but a strict social duty, end quote. So there's some final efforts after the 19th Amendment passed. It did not end the anti-suffrage fight at all. The Maryland Anti-Suffrage Group established a concerted 2-year effort to destroy the amendment and any future amending powers of the state legislature. First, the group lobbied member Emile Lesser's husband, Oscar, who was a prominent tax lawyer, to file a suit that would challenge the amendment in court. The case, filed against two women, one African-American, one white, it sued these two women who had registered to vote. It became known as Lesser v. Garnett and went all the way to the Supreme Court. Second, as part of the suit by Oscar Lesser, the Maryland anti-suffrage chapter and several prominent Maryland lawyers formed the short-lived Maryland League for State Defense, which sought to ensure the defeat of the 19th Amendment in court and that no amendment to the Maryland Constitution would ever be passed by the legislature without a voter referendum. In a 9-0 ruling, the 19th Amendment was upheld in court in 1922. And the Maryland anti-suffragists quietly disbanded. The State Defense League fizzled out by 1923. Finally, many of the anti-suffragists formed other activist groups that were dedicated to opposing federal or state women's rights legislation. These included the Women's Constitutional League of Maryland and the Maryland Federation of Democratic Women, which had fairly long runs well after the 19th Amendment. One just last notable example that these two last groups did, they opposed maternity leave, basically, for the women in the workplace in the 1920s.
So thanks, Harrison. So far, we have focused predominantly on the white suffrage experience. But as we continue to do research and as we've continued to research for this exhibit, we've also uncovered stories about African-American women and suffrage. So I'm going to turn it now over to Joe. And Joe, what else have we discovered in our collection?
Thanks, Ashley. Let's turn away from heels and toward heroes. I'm here today to highlight the work of some amazing women, two who passed away long ago and two who are still with us today and who were very important in helping us understand the materials in our holdings. The first person I'd like to talk about is Estelle Hall Young, who was a friend and neighbor of Augusta Chisel, who Ashley previously discussed. Born in Georgia in 1884, Estelle Hall Young attended Spelman College and the Atlanta University, where she was a student of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Trained as a school teacher, she taught in Atlanta until 1905 when she moved to Baltimore. Young devoted herself to civic causes in the Baltimore area, and in 1915 she established the first African-American women's suffrage club in the United States, the Progressive Women's Suffrage Club, for which she also served as president. While our state's white suffrage groups and politicians worked to prevent Black women from voting, Young's Club held classes at Baltimore's Black YWCA to teach African-American women the political process involved with voting. In 1918, Estelle Hall Young spoke at an event at Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church, the political hub and most prominent Black Methodist church in the city. The event was called Woman's Day. Young's father-in-law, Alfred Young, who was a graduate of Howard University, was the pastor at Sharp Street. He, incidentally, was born a slave in Cambridge, Maryland, and was emancipated at the age of 17. In the 1930s, Mrs. Young was given an Award of Honor from the NAACP's Maryland State Conference of Branches. She was cited for meritorious service in the cause of obtaining justice and full citizenship rights. She was also active in the Republican Party in the 1920s and 30s and lobbied her senators to support anti-lynching legislation. When Estelle Young died on August 19, 1938, she was serving as the state examiner of beauticians. She is buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery alongside her husband and daughter. Next slide, please. So the previous photo of Estelle Hall Young and the one that you're looking at now are taken from the N. Louise Young photo collection at MDHS. N. Louise Young was Estelle's daughter, and I should note that Louise Young holds the distinction of being Maryland's first practicing African-American female physician. MDHS is fortunate to have her photo collection. Often photos in our collections are unmarked. This one was simply described in the finding aid as Mrs. Howard E. Young and unidentified women, parentheses, suffragists? Thanks to researcher Jean Thompson, who conducted research for Maryland Women's Heritage Center in Annapolis, we now have a better idea of what we're looking at here. I should also note that Jean wrote a great piece in the special edition issue To the Front, Black Women and the Vote, produced by the Afro newspaper. I think later we'll put a URL up showing you how to get to that. Jean's article, Lifting as We Climb, looks at the origins of the National Association of Colored Women. I'm going to quote Jean's theory on this photograph because it's very interesting. And I should also note that our photograph collections at MDHS are very near and dear to my heart. So here's what Jean thinks. We are looking at West Baltimore women who indeed were suffragists, but who were gathered for a different purpose. They were paid a visit by Mrs. Booker T. Washington, appearing in Velvet and Pearls, second from the right. Jean says, I believe she is flanked by Ida Cummings, Minnie Gaines, and Bertha Hurst on the left, and Estelle Young on the right. Mrs. Washington visited Baltimore numerous times and stayed in the home of Bertha Hurst on at least one of those occasions. Ida Cummings was the recording secretary of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and Mrs. Washington was its president. The NACW convention was held in Baltimore in 1916. This kind of gives us an idea of when this might have been taken. And there were pre-convention planning meetings, so perhaps it was from before 1916. Also, there was a local committee that attended the NACW convention about 2 years prior to the pitch that Baltimore be the next location to do the local footwork. Most of the same group of women here were active in the Du Bois Circle and other Baltimore civic groups. Mrs. Washington also spoke here in Baltimore at a National Churchwomen's Conference. The women here also helped organize a fundraiser for Mrs. Washington after her husband passed away. So I want to give an extra special thanks to Jean Thompson for her help with this. Whenever researchers come in and talk to us, it's great, but when they can actually shed light on our own collections and help us improve our finding aids, it's a really wonderful thing. I also want to thank Savannah Woods and the Afro for helping us positively ID the people in this photograph. So next we have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was born in Baltimore in 1825 and raised by her aunt and uncle, who took her in after she became an orphan at the age of 3 in 1828. Frances Ellen Watkins was an orator, abolitionist, temperance activist, poet, novelist, and artist. Sadly, she has remained for years unknown to all but a small handful of scholars. This has recently begun to change. Frances Watkins Harper published her first collection of poetry called Forest Leaves at age 21. She joined the abolition movement in 1854 and began a decades-long career as a committed writer and activist for major social reform movements during the 19th century. According to Dr. Corintha Mitchell, Watkins Harper was, quote, a model citizen who could not vote. In the late 1860s, Watkins Harper called out Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and the Women's Christian Temperance Union for their denigration of Black men and their dismissal of the voting rights due Black people. Yet, she continued to work with the WCTU. Very little is known about Harper's childhood in Baltimore. In fact, Forest Leaves is the only primary source on the subject. At age 13, she began to work as a domestic servant for a couple who owned a bookstore in Baltimore. Her uncle, William Watkins, who founded his own academy, had Frances attend the academy, so she got a very good education. Next slide, please. So while I'm certainly no biographer of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, there is an interesting story about her related to the Maryland Historical Society. You're looking at a pamphlet from our collection called Forest Leaves, published circa 1846. It was believed lost to history until it was rediscovered that Maryland Historical Society had a copy. Researcher Johanna Ortner noticed it on a visit in early 2015. Ortner says that this work shows how Watkins Harper was able to distribute her first poems within the nation's burgeoning print culture. Forest Leaves was published by printer James Young, who owned a printing business and was also a leader in the Maryland temperance movement, helping to found Maryland's branch of the Sons of Temperance organization in Harper's hometown. Having books and pamphlets printed was not a low-cost venture for writers during that time, and it's believed that Harper could not have afforded to pay the high prices on a domestic servant's salary. There's an interesting thing that I'd like to point out on the title page of Forest Leaves, which includes the abbreviated words for Maryland Historical Society. And this part of it is still kind of a mystery to us. It could indicate that Maryland Historical Society played some role in publishing this early work. It does not appear to be a stamp. It appears to be printed in the same ink as everything around it. So more research is needed to determine the connection between Watkins Harper, printer James Young, and the Maryland Historical Society. And that's what I know.
Thanks, Joe. So again, as we said, this is just a snippet of what we are going to be able to display in our very first virtual exhibition. So here we have a little bit of information to kind of whet your palate about what you're going to see in this exhibit. It is going to be live starting on September 9th, and it will be live through March 30th, or 31st rather, 2021. So we hope that you all will have a chance to explore around on our new exhibition. So we just want to say thank you, and I think it's time to open it up to a Q&A.
Hi, Ashley, thanks. Well, I do see there's been a lot of discussions in the chat for us, which some of my colleagues have been answering as we've been going along. There was a very interesting question from Joan, who said that her mother remembers going to vote for the first time, going to the polls together. And the question she wanted to clarify, even though that Maryland was late in ratifying, were Maryland women able to vote still, even though the ratification date was long for Maryland? And she also asked who were the major candidates of the time. I think Harrison, did you have something to say about that? Can you explain a little bit more about Joan's question and comment?
Sure. So even though Maryland hadn't ratified the amendment just yet, Maryland women showed up to the polls on November 2nd, 1920. That was their election day. Neither party actually had women's suffrage on their platform until 1916. And in 1920, both parties formally had it on their platform. Warren G. Harding was elected president in 1920. And so just because a state hasn't ratified something doesn't mean that you're not allowed to do it, if that makes any sense. For example, the 13th Amendment in, I believe it was Mississippi, wasn't ratified there until 2013. But that doesn't mean that there were slaves in Mississippi until 2013. So.
I see. So to Joan's comment about having this memory or her mother sharing this memory with her, that would be accurate. Her grandmother would still have been able to vote, even though we didn't ratify that. Okay, thank you, Harrison. And let's see, there are a lot of talk about Forest Leaves, Joe, that's in the chat. Do we have any idea, you said this is published by Harper. Do we have any idea about like accuracy, about accuracy of the poem online or in other forms? Has anyone or you researched other printings or other, I guess, ways that we are all might be familiar with farce leaves?
Well, there are certainly other scholars who have done work on Frances Helen Watkins Harper. As far as forest leaves go, when it was found in our collection, which, I guess we knew it was in our collection, but didn't know how rare it was when the right people found it, specifically Johanna Ortner. It was certainly a very big deal to her. And so she published an article about her findings. And we worked with the publisher, which was commonplace.org, where you can go and look for her article. Her article also contains an image of every page in this pamphlet. So we've essentially put this pamphlet online. You can read her poems. I don't know, other than Johanna, who the predominant scholar on forest leaves is, but hopefully it got some discussion started and people are specifically looking into it and hopefully doing their doctorate work on the topic.
Yeah, someone actually, Sharon and some others, put the link to Commonplace in the chat. And there's a little bit of a discussion in there. So hopefully that will spark some interest in further investigation. I also see, how did, Morgan is asking, how did Maryland suffragists work with suffragists from other states? Like in the example of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cody Stanton. Can any of you answer that or maybe share some more information?
Yeah, I can jump in. So there is evidence of women in Maryland going and marching in other protests. There is maybe some evidence suggesting that Amelia Hymes Walker was part of the Silent Sentinels. Those were the women who would stand out in front of the White House picketing. I don't know how accurate that information is, so that's why I didn't fully include it. But there is some evidence that still needs to be uncovered to fully put these women in other places working with other groups. But I know that women from states all over the country would come together for these marches, and especially in Washington, D.C.
I could also add to that a little bit as well, if that's okay. In 1912, Baltimore was host to the Democratic National Convention, where they eventually nominated, and we elected Woodrow Wilson as president. But there was a huge suffrage march held by Marylanders and people from all over the country that came to Baltimore to protest outside the 5th Regiment Armory, which is on Howard Street.
Thank you, Harrison. Let's see, Mallory, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the collection that we have on the Suffrage News. What other things did you explore or come across while you were in searching through? And how many, actually, do you think that you have looked through all of the Suffrage News that we have, or?
Well, I certainly looked through all of the volumes, if you can say flipped through at least. We have about 9 or 10 volumes in total dating from 1912 to 1920. But what I actually found most interesting were the pro-suffrage political cartoons that were on the front of every issue of the Suffrage News. They ranged from election information to big business, the war, World War I, I mean, and stuff like that. And they're just really interesting. And you'll be able to see more of that in our virtual exhibit.
Actually, thank you, Mallory. And that brings me to my next question. Of all the stories that we touched on a little bit today, what actually will these stories, will all of them or some of them be included in our Forgotten Fight exhibition virtually? Will some of the objects that you talked about, like Joe, the actual book, be on display or be looked at a little bit more in depth virtually?
That's a great question, Margot, because I'm very familiar with our plans for when this was going to be a physical space that you could walk into, and we had some really cool ideas. So the pivot to go virtual really shook things up, and I think the people helping us build the website are doing a great job. I don't know that Forest Leaves will be, but again, there's that link that is being passed around in the chats, and so you can literally read every page of it. But that's a good question that I cannot fully answer.
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, we're on schedule for an on-site exhibition, but this will be our first ever virtual. So we did have to be a little bit more creative, right, everyone, with how we presented our story and what we were going to say. Harrison or Mallory, do you have anything else to add about that, what's included in the exhibition and the stories that you spoke of today?
Yeah, sure. So the exhibit will of course be sort of a timeline of voting rights in Maryland. So it will start with Margaret Brent in 1648. And there will also be points all the way up until, the 2000s as well, related to voting rights. There will be a prompt when you enter the site, which will allow you to assume an identity, if you will, or a character. And at certain anchor points within the timeline, you might be allowed to vote or you might not be, depending on what your character is. So these are different people. Some are women, some are African American, some are Asian American. So we're doing it that way so people can see sort of the progression of voting rights over time. And so there'll be pictures involved. There'll be images of the objects, some of which we've shown. And yes, Joe, we were planning on adding in Forest Leaves as a late addition. So that will also be included in the exhibit.
Well, thank you. That actually presents a good visual image of what the virtual exhibition will include and be like for all of us. And I can say that we're all very excited about being able to present this exhibition virtually, as long as some other on-site surprises that we have looking forward toward in September. I just want to thank all of you for joining us today at our lunch virtual program. Thank you to my colleagues, Ashley, Mallory, Joe, and Harrison, for doing this with us today. And all of you out there, stay tuned to our website, mail, and social media. We have some excellent fall programming coming up and some surprises we have coming your way as well. So stay tuned and look forward to be with us in September. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.